Keir Starmer, in terms of his personal authority, has never been as powerful and never will be as powerful as he is right now. This is as good as it gets. That might seem counterintuitive, or to put it simply, downright thick, because after all, Keir Starmer hopes to become Prime Minister later this year. And as Prime Minister, he will have enormous power, all the gears and handles and cranks that this son of a toolmaker could desire. That's what he wants, state power. And of course, he would have huge heft as Prime Minister. But as Prime Minister, you are also very constrained. You are constrained above all by the torrent of events coming towards you. You're constrained by the loyalty and discipline of your colleagues, by budgets, by money, by numbers, by voting numbers, all of that. And in a parallel world, Keir Starmer could sit down with Rishi Sunak, and Rishi Sunak could tell him just how actually constrained day to day the job of being Prime Minister really is. Whereas right now, as leader of the opposition, 20 points clear of the Conservatives, Keir Starmer has extraordinarily unconstrained freedom, personal freedom.
I'm pretty comfortable with this.
He doesn't really face a particularly torrid press. I know there are a lot of people in his office who think the press has never been more hostile to Labour, but as I was arguing earlier in the year, the Conservative press is now deeply divided between Reform UK
Thank you very much.
and the right of the Tory party. They're fighting amongst themselves. They're not really looking at Keir Starmer or Labour at the moment.
You've gone on the record saying you want Rishi Sunak out, you want a replacement. Would you like to see Kemi Badenoch come through the ranks?
Oh, God, no, definitely not, no.
Second, he has almost no organised or real opposition inside the party. Even after all the rows over Gaza, the left inside the Labour Party is really disorganised, demoralised. It's not getting any candidates selected for parliamentary seats, and it doesn't have any pressure on him. Inside Parliament as well, the Parliamentary Labour Party is enormously disciplined at the moment.
Call an election so he and the whole country can move on.
Because I'm an old git, I have been covering the Commons since about 1984, and I cannot remember a single time in that period when the Parliamentary Labour Party has been more disciplined and united behind its leader than it is now. So no constraints from the media, no constraints really from inside the party and the wider Labour family, not even from the trade unions at the moment, by the way. And really, no great pressure from the Tories either. The Tories have so many problems of their own, they are not putting intense pressure on him. So this, as I say, is a moment of maximum lack of constraint or freedom or power, whatever you call it. And so the real question is, what does he do with it? Before answering that question, I have to concede that he doesn't look unconstrained. There's a great big new Labour campaigning document out at the moment, which is a pre-manifesto document. And on the front, Keir Starmer has pursed lips, a very serious expression, staring into the middle distance like a man with serious anxieties and the weight of the world on his shoulders. And he's a bit like that in the House of Commons as well. That is his natural demeanour, of course, but I think it reflects real anxiety inside his office about the timing of the election. They don't really believe the polls. They're really suspicious about the press. They know there's lots of elephant traps coming ahead in the budget in March and possibly an autumn statement beyond that. So they feel a lot of anxiety still. And this anxiety is focused very much at the moment about the timing of the election, because there are people very, very close to Keir Starmer who remain pretty convinced there will be a May election. And many, many other people, I think the majority of people think there will be a November, probably November the 14th election. And it's not just about, when Labour spends the money that it's got. It's not just about how quickly they choose their candidates or when they finally complete their manifesto. February the 11th is the date people are told have their final submissions in for the manifesto. It's not just about all those practical things which matter a great deal. It's also about the kind of election there would be. Because if there was an early election, that could only be because Rishi Sunak had lost control of things. And this rolling, small-scale, but really debilitating Tory revolt against him had gathered pace. And that somehow things were falling apart, which I think is perfectly possible. So it would be an election taking place against an atmosphere of chaos. But an early, chaotic election would probably produce, I suspect, a pretty extreme and rather fantasy Tory election manifesto, based on really deep tax cuts, perhaps bringing the Navy back from the Red Sea, to take on the small boats or whatever. And in that kind of election, there wouldn't be very much focus on the macroeconomics of investment and tax and so forth. It would really be about stability. And that would play in many ways to Keir Starmer's core strengths of stability, steadiness under fire, a certain doer professionalism. But a November election would be very different indeed. That would be almost certainly under the shadow of Trump. Now, we don't know if Trump is going to win in November, but he's marching towards victory at the moment. And the Trump victory changes absolutely everything. It suddenly means that Europe has to look after its own defence and pay for its own defence. So huge defence investment decisions immediately ahead of whatever government is elected. It also means, I think, just because America becomes a much less attractive partner, our traditional partner, that a future Labour government would be pushed even more closely towards the EU. Wouldn't join the EU, but the pressure to be close to the EU would be very strong. So investment in Europe would be much more central to a November election than it would be to a May one. And those are the kind of choices that are being batted around and ricocheting all around Keir Starmer's office at the moment. And they are reflected in certain personnel arguments about who's up, who's down. There's been attacks on Sue Gray, his new chief of staff, for instance, for being not political enough and too much the civil servant. Everyone I talk to pushes back and says that is not her job. She's not there as a politician. She's there to reorganise the office, improve the relationships, and she's doing very, very well with that. Not to make policy, not to campaign. She's much more like Jonathan Powell, former civil servant, was when he came into the Blair team in the mid-1990s. They're there to prepare Labour for government, not to actually be Labour politicians themselves. And actually, when I talk to shadow cabinet members, they mostly really like Sue Gray because she wants to have the right people in the room for every meeting. And that means bringing in shadow cabinet politicians, bringing in the political voices into the key meetings that count. They, not surprisingly, like that. So that's one level of turbulence going on. There's also a certain amount of chatter about the communications or press team. And that is also interesting. I'm not particularly interested in the personalities here because they don't really count. I think there's a kind of journalism that obsesses with the personalities of spads and junior people, and it's not terribly helpful. But below that, there is a really interesting discussion going on, really about how you sell Keir Starmer. Because there are veteran Blairites who've been around for a long time who think that they should be selling Keir Starmer, as it were, as a new Blair, comparing him with Tony Blair and the 1990s. And there are others, and I would agree with the others, who say this is actually quite a dangerous strategy because Keir Starmer is no Tony Blair. He is a very, very different politician, a very different man. And I think trying to pretend that he's got Blair's kind of youthful, charismatic, bright sort of 1990s smile is not going to help Keir Starmer. It may even diminish him. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. Tony Blair not only was interested in the market, he rather looks up to the market. He looks up to business, big business. He likes those kind of people. He likes how they operate.
We are publishing today details of agreements involving government and the private sector for the biggest public-private partnership in any education system anywhere in the world.
Now, Keir Starmer needs business, wants business, and is wooing business very hard, but he is fundamentally a creature of the state. He was public prosecutor. He ran the public prosecutor's office, DPP, all of that, and he's been a lawyer on human rights cases. He is somebody who is much more instinctively pro a strong, active state, working with business, rather than Tony Blair, who wanted to bring the ethos and indeed some of the personalities of business right into the centre of the state.
Speed ahead with great British energy. A new energy company that will harness clean British power for good British jobs. A company that will be publicly owned conference and we will be based in Scotland.
They are very, very different. And I would argue that post-pandemic and in dangerous times, the Keir Starmer vision is much more appropriate to the moment than Tony Blair's vision. So don't make too many comparisons. That is the kind of argument that is going on. And so when you say in a serious way, OK, what is Keir Starmer really for? What is the agenda? There is a good answer and it's a long answer. And it was one he gave in his last conference speech. And it goes something like, in 1945, Clement Attlee had to rebuild a shattered country.
We went all out to win the war and now have to start afresh.
1964, Harold Wilson comes in and he has to join us to the technological revolution.
We believe that we can't go on standing still, and this programme is a way to get us on the move.
1997, it's Tony Blair, and again he has to rebuild the public realm after the Tory years.
Modernising our welfare state, rebuilding our National Health Service.
Now, Starmer says, we have to do all of those three things at the same time. rather as he has been Kinnock and John Smith and Tony Blair in terms of Labour revival. Now, that is a very good answer, but as you've noticed, it's also rather a long one. And it isn't just a long answer. It isn't really an answer that replies directly to the great misery faced by people up and down the country, millions of people who simply can't pay their bills.
I've been really hungry the last 3 days.
The people highlighted recently by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who found 1 in 5 people in the country in poverty and millions of our fellow citizens in what they called very deep poverty.
What about lunch?
No. I just fill up on tea.
Labour does need to answer those people, and that means tax, and that means spending, and that means priorities.
The amount you've got in your bank account currently?
11 pence. And that's it.
Now, I want to bring this down to a few really important political issues, of which the biggest one is probably the £28 billion Green Prosperity Plan, Labour's Green Plan. And as you will have noticed, I'm sure, there's a massive argument about this. I reported some time ago that current government spending under the Conservatives on the kind of things included in the Green Prosperity Plan would count in the 28 billion. The government spent about 8 to 10 billion on that so far, so the 28 billion comes down to about 20 billion. And it is also being pushed back to the middle of a future Labour government's term when Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, says we will be able to afford that kind of money. We're not going to do it straight away. So it's already coming down, but I think that 28 billion number is going to disappear. The, as it were, ex-Blairites around Starmer say we must give the smallest possible target for the Conservatives. And it's quite clear that Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, and indeed Rishi Sunak are going relentlessly for that 28 billion.
His ideas to spend £28 billion. He has no plan to pay for this £28 billion. His £28 billion green spending spree.
They've been told by Isaac Levido, running the Conservative campaign, go for that 28 billion, go for that 28 billion. They're vulnerable. That's a huge number. Tell people that if they spend that kind of money, they'll have to jack up taxes or jack up borrowing, and you will be poorer. That is the Tory strategy, and therefore get off the number, says Labour.
You can't make that commitment anymore, can you?
The fiscal rules will come first, and all of our policies will be subject to that iron discipline.
And in many ways, I think it is right to get off the number. Not just for that reason, but because a big number means nothing to most people. What does 28 billion actually mean to you? Labour needs to start talking about what it really wants to do. It has to talk about the need for green steel so that we can start to build things in this country with our own steel. It has to talk about the need to reconnect big parts of the grid and produce onshore wind so that we get all the advantages of non-polluting energy that we can in this country. It needs to talk about the importance of insulating far more homes, because if your home is insulated, your bills are much, much lower. These down-to-earth practical things do need to replace this figure about 28 billion, which has become a kind of Ark of the Covenant or shibboleth fought over, by the Philistines and the Israelites all over. That's probably not the right metaphor for this week, but you get the message. The trouble with ditching not just the 28 billion, but the actual Green Prosperity Plan itself, is that this is Labour's answer to growth. This is Labour's growth plan, or at least the core of it.
The biggest chance we've had for decades.
Clean power to cut bills for families across the country.
Good jobs, with decent wages, and with pride in the work that we are doing.
Get rid of that and you get rid of hope. Get rid of that and you get rid of definition between Labour and the Conservatives completely. Get rid of that and in many ways you get rid of the point of the Labour Party at the moment.
Making this a reality is harder to do, but we embrace the challenge.
And, there is a similar big issue, I suspect, coming up over income tax cuts. It's no great secret that Jeremy Hunt is looking at tax cuts for the budget. He keeps talking about it, in fact.
When we can, we want to bring down the tax burden.
It's very easy for Labour, or relatively easy for Labour, if the Tories decide to cut inheritance tax, because this is such a regressive tax cut, helping the top 3%. That I think Labour could oppose that in quite a popular vote-winning way. But income tax cuts are, of course, much harder. And Labour keeps saying that ordinary working families are overtaxed at the moment. So it's very hard for Labour to oppose income tax cuts directly or say that they would reverse them. But I think what they need to do is to, as it were, flip the argument in a big way. Because if you cut income tax in a serious way right now, given the fragility of the economy and the huge quantity of borrowing on the back of the economy, then you just cannot spend the money on public services that the country, and particularly people who will vote Labour, expect. So Labour has to say, OK, if you have those tax cuts, that means 40 hospital closures. That means closures of schools around the country. That means the court system completely jamming up. That means your bins won't be collected by local authorities. All those things. If that's what you want, vote for it. If that's what you want, support it. In other words, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So I don't think this is something that can be done by shadow cabinet ministers on television interviews, kind of desperately dancing around the issue. I think this needs a big intervention by Rachel Reeves or Keir Starmer, or probably both. What they have to say is, we believe in reinvestment. We believe in a stronger state for dangerous and frightening times. We believe in putting the money into the public services, rebuilding the public realm. We are the builders. That is who they are. That is who Keir Starmer is. And this is the moment for him to say so much more directly. There must be some kind of phrase you could use for this. What could it be? Something like, let's get Britain's future back.